So a lot of scholars claim that we don't have any evidence for the Joshua conquest. None. And they say we should have evidence of it. And they say that Jericho has been destroyed a long time ago. It looks like some of these sites that they talk about in the book of Joshua has been destroyed a long time ago, a lot earlier than it should have been. So things just don't line up. So how would you respond to that? What is the archaeological evidence for the conquest of Canaan?
Well, thank you for having me, Jacob, and that's a great question. Yeah, and really, you've loaded a lot of stuff in that one question. Yeah, how does the archaeological evidence line up? Yeah, yeah. The search for the conquest of Joshua, of course, is quite old, and it's often referred to as the conquest model, and associated with a famous American archaeologist named William Foxwell Albright, whom I revere very much. He was died in the 1970s. I don't remember the exact year. I'm thinking around 1975. But he spent much of his life working in Israel. And of course, he conducted a number of excavations and made numerous contributions to the field of archaeology. So a very, very pioneering archaeologist, again, whom I revere very much. But his approach to thinking about early Israelite origins in the land of Canaan was an approach in which he expected major conquest all over the land. And so while he worked on other projects, he was constantly returning to this issue of the conquest, and he was looking for violent destruction. Initially, he looked for that in the 15th century, but after he began to find some destruction levels in the 13th century BC, he shifted his view and adopted what's come to be known today as the late date model of the Exodus conquest. So he concluded that must have happened in the 13th century BC. And as he went around the country of Israel, anytime he would find a 13th century BC destruction, he would associate that with the early Israelites. I'm exaggerating just a little bit, but my point is he expected to find ruined cities, cities that had undergone conflagration all over the land of Israel, and he just saw the conquest as a wholesale destruction of cities in the land of Canaan in the 13th century BC. So again, associated destructions wherever he found them with the early Israelites and tried to harmonize the data. Part of the problem with that approach is that really it's imposing expectations upon the biblical text that the text does not claim for itself. The text of Joshua only claims that 3 cities were burned, and those were Jericho, Ai, and Chatzor. And so, we know that in the ancient world, battles tended not to be fought inside the cities. They tended to be fought in the open field. We have a number of references in the Bible to, for example, during the reign of David, it says when springtime came, as was the custom, the kings would go out and meet on the battlefield. But David stayed home. So they didn't tend to stay in the city so that their city would be attacked, but the armies would meet out on the fields and do their fighting there. And you have one really clear example of this in the book of Joshua, in Joshua chapter 7, when it says the Israelites lured the inhabitants of Ai out into the fields, and that's where they fought them. So, you have lots of mentions of battles in the book of Joshua. But I think readers have this assumption that the Israelites would sweep inside those cities, and they imagined the collapse of skyscrapers, like the bringing down of the Sears Tower and things like this, where you just have tons of evidence of urban conflagration. But again, the text actually only says that 3 cities were destroyed: Jericho, Ai, and Chatzor. So I really think a big part of the issue with thinking about the early Israelite origins in the land of Canaan and the conquest, a big part of the problem has to do with reader expectations, what readers expect to find. And I hate to criticize Albright, the revered master, but I think he was had somewhat of a distorted expectation when he approached the text. And of course, that led to alternate proposals for thinking about how the conquest happened. And really, that had already begun even prior to the time of Albright. Yeah, so are there evidences of conquest? Are there destruction layers? Are there ruined cities? Well, the evidence at Jericho is somewhat problematic, and the evidence at Ai is also problematic. We do have a clear destruction layer at Chatzor. Of course, the issue there is who was responsible for that destruction. And we have a later destruction layer at Dan, which of course was far outside of the original territorial allotments envisioned in Joshua 13 through 21. And the text of Judges claims, text of Judges claims that the Israelites were unable to take the territory Joshua had allotted to them, and so they migrated far north and took that city. So we do have a destruction layer there as well. So I'd say Jericho. Well, the major cities of the conquest would be Jericho, Ai, Chatzor, and Dan. And of course, the issue would be how to interpret the archaeological data at each of those sites.
So do all of those destruction layers date to the same century, the 13th century BCE?
Well, so Jericho and Ai are problematic, and I don't know how much detail to go into here, but Jericho, of course, has been heavily excavated, and there have been a series of excavations conducted there. There had been a team that had gone in prior to the time of John Garstang, and he was the British archaeologist who went in I don't remember the exact dates offhand of his excavation, but prior to the time of Kathleen Kenyon. And another team had been there prior to Garstang, and they concluded, they drew conclusions about the site that really subverted any possibility of a conquest. And so Garstang was dissatisfied with that, and he went in behind them and excavated the site. I can get you the exact dates of his excavation here. Yeah, he went into the site behind them, and let's see. Yeah, from 1932 to 1936 was the time of his excavation. And his purpose in excavating the site, of course, really was to undergird the biblical text. And he felt that he found walls and evidence of destruction, and he dated the destruction he found to the 15th century. So he subscribed to an early date Exodus conquest, and felt that he had vindicated the biblical text. Well, a few years later, so he finished his excavation in 36. By the early 1950s, excavation methods had improved, new technologies had been developed, and so on. And so he asked Kathleen Kenyon if she would come along behind him. She was quite a well-known excavator already. She had cut her teeth in Africa and conducted a number of other excavations on her own. And her father had been the pioneer of stratigraphic excavation, which she also implemented in his wake. So Garstang asked Kenyon to come behind him and check his findings. He wanted to know, had he really proved Joshua's destruction of Jericho, or or were there issues that needed to be worked out, and so on. And so she came along, and I'm trying to remember exactly how she said it. She said basically that she thought one quick season would be enough to, check his findings and reach some solid conclusions. But when she went to the site, she spent one season, I think, excavating and realized that extensive further work needed to be conducted. And so she went back to the site and excavated from 1952 to 58. And it was interesting because she found virtually no evidence of late bronze inhabitation at the site. And she was somewhat disturbed by that because she was good friends with Garstang, and she didn't want to hurt his feelings, and she didn't want to come across as having subverted the biblical text. And this was around I don't remember the dates exactly, maybe 1951. She basically said that the city had been uninhabited during the Late Bronze II, which would be the time of the Israelite conquest. And so it's interesting, when most people who write commentaries on Joshua today, when they talk about Kenyon, they will talk about her. She's perceived in different ways. So often evangelicals or folks who have a more conservative view of the Bible, they kind of see Kenyon as a bad guy. She disproved the Bible, this kind of thing. She disproved the conquest account at Jericho. And it's quite interesting. She did not set about to do that. She had no animosity toward the Bible. She was not a minimalist. There's a wonderful biography that was published of Kenyon just a few years ago, and I'm actually about 3/4 of the way through it right now. I'm just now reading it, and I'm drawing a blank on the title, and I'm drawing a blank on the author's name. But it's quite good. It's a British author, and she talks about this very issue. She said Kenyon was very religious and was a lifelong churchgoer throughout her life, and she just was not, did not set about to disprove the Joshua account. So anyway, but those were her findings in around 1951. What's interesting is that she continued to excavate, and in the subsequent years, she did find late Bronze Age remains. She found several walls, parts of lower courses of walls that dated to the Late Bronze II. She found remains of a floor, and she found some detritus of late Bronze occupation on that floor. And so in several places, she wrote and explained that clearly there had been late Bronze Age II inhabitation at this site, and it may very well have been the Jericho of the time of Joshua. She also went on to explain that because of the location and climate and so on of Jericho, that there had been extensive erosion at the site, and that the reason for not finding further LB2 remains was that everything above the Middle Bronze levels had been eroded away. So what she found was just a little bit of LB2 remains, and she said this could very well be associated with Joshua, but the rest has eroded away. So she said that in several publications. It's kind of interesting when people write about Joshua today, they tend to point to her earlier conclusions, and they don't mention those later conclusions. So that's Jericho. She said that Jericho should not be used to, that those choppy remains, she said, should not be used to try to disprove the biblical account, and, that they may not conform to the great expectations people may have, but they couldn't be used to disprove the Joshua account. She said there clearly was late bronze inhabitation of the site. At Ai, the city of Ai, and you just interrupt me if I'm going too long. A guy named Joseph Calloway went to excavate the site that's conventionally been identified as Ai. It's Et Tel is the name of the site, and he was a very interesting character. He went into archaeology as a second career. He had actually been a farmer, and so he went into archaeology, and he was very much interested in discovering the conquest and in trying to establish the truth of the conquest account. What he found at the city of Ai, let's see, I want to make sure I get it correct here. He concluded at the city, he found tremendous remains that dated to the Middle Bronze Age. But he concluded that the Middle Bronze Age site had been abandoned, if I remember right, from like 2200 BC all the way down until roughly 1200 BC. So he concluded that essentially that the site of Ai was uninhabited at the time of the conquest, what had become by that time the conventionally accepted date of the 13th century BC. So he concluded the site had been uninhabited. What happens at the beginning of the Iron Age 1, so roughly around 1200 BC, is you have a very small village that was established at the site. And it's similar to the early Israelite villages of the highlands. So very simple, lots of pits dug on the site, very, just very basic, kind of a farmstead. But he didn't find a destruction prior to that. So this led Calloway to totally change the way he read the Bible. And he essentially shifted away from a conquest model to a peaceful infiltration model, or some permutation of the peaceful infiltration model. And it really overhauled his whole way of approaching the Bible. He wrote an article after several seasons of excavation at I think it was published in the Biblical Archaeology Review, and the name of the article was my excavation at Ai worthwhile? And so he was wrestling with that question. Since I didn't find what I expected, and since it seemed to disprove the conquest model, what was the whole thing worthwhile? It just changed the way he approached the Bible. He concluded that it was worthwhile in his mind because it led him to what he viewed as a more honest reading of Scripture. The challenge with the site, though, I'm not satisfied with Calloway's conclusions. And there have been a number of ways various scholars have tried to respond to Calloway's discoveries. One has been the two approaches typical of more conservative scholars who have a higher view of Scripture, or evangelicals. One approach has been to date the conquest to earlier periods. So to say, well, okay, there was nothing there at that time, so it must have been in a different period. So to try to redate it. Another approach has been to look for an alternative site to say, well, Et Tel must not be the correct location. And this has been a common approach, particularly among evangelicals, to advocate for other sites. I had a teacher when I was in my doctoral program up in Michigan, a brilliant archaeologist named David Merling. And he wrote about the city of Ai, and he said, you know, it's interesting that in Hebrew, the name Ha'ai, Ai means ruin, and it has the definite article on it. So in Hebrew, the hay, so Ha'ai, the ruin. And he said, maybe that's not actually a site name, but it's just a reference to the ruin, you know, this ruin over here. And, you know, we do know that populations in the ancient Near East, you know, there was this fluctuation between nomadization and sedentarization. And so sometimes populations would settle among ruins. You can see that today when you look at Bedouin populations, they'll often back up their tents and attach their tents to ruins. And so you'll see kind of a conglomeration of urban ruins with Bedouin tents attached to the remaining walls and so on. And Merling said, what if this was literally, I was literally the ruin, and Joshua and his army were attacking the squatters who lived among the ruins, and they set fire to the grass on the site. You know what? So again, he's going back to this question: what should we expect to find at the site? You know, is this the bringing down of the Sears Tower, or an attack on a population living among some ruins? You know, all the text says is, and Joshua burned Ai. That's all. In Hebrew, it's just 3 words. In English, it's 4, but that's the only description of the battle. And Joshua burned Ai. So maybe they attacked the squatters living among the ruins and set fire to the grass on the tell. So I don't know. I mean, he's just kind of speculating there, but pushing modern readers to think more carefully about how they read the text and what kinds of expectations they take to the text. Now at Chatzor, you have a very clear destruction layer that that city was excavated for several years by Yigal Yadin, and then followed by his student Amnon Ben-Tor, long excavation. And they both found a very clear destruction, which they dated to around 1230, if I recall exactly. The question there is who destroyed it. There's nothing outside of the Bible. There are no archaeological. There's no archaeological evidence that makes that clear. But there are some suggestive things that might indicate that the Israelites were responsible for that. But there have been other interpretations as well.
So from what you said earlier, you've mentioned that some people have had some high expectations about the Joshua conquest. So you think basically in some ways, some people have unintentionally exaggerated what the book of Joshua says. So that's why they say, oh, they expect to find destruction layers everywhere, all over again, as if it was a massive invasion. But that's not what Joshua describes.
Well, that's true. Yeah, the big question is, you know, what does the book of Joshua actually describe? And again, modern readers tend to go to that book and they think that the book is largely about conquest, and when we think about war, I think modern readers tend to impose upon the text of Joshua their own conception of what war is. When we think of war, we think of the destruction of cities, the dropping of bombs, the collapse of skyscrapers, and things like this. And when you read the book of Joshua, that there is a lot of language about the utter destruction, the command to completely destroy, to wipe out the given location, whatever that was. And texts, for example, in Deuteronomy 7 will say, annihilate the population, including women and children. So we get this image of just this a blitzkrieg that sweeps through an urban location, a town, a city, whatever, and just annihilates every living thing. And this kind of expectation, again, it's driven by modern conceptions and modern experiences. We living in the 20th century, which incidentally is probably the most violent century in the history of the world. Well, we're in the 21st century, but 20th century is probably the most violent century in the history of the world. So we've seen, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We've seen entire populations decimated. We've seen genocide implemented where one population was able to go into another population with machine guns and weapons of mass destruction. And so this is what we take. This is what drives that perception, that we impose on, on the book of Joshua. But when we go to the book of Joshua, we have to keep in mind that the author or authors of the book of Joshua, they wrote that book using conventional battle report language. And when you look at literature from the ancient world and you look at battle reports like what we have in Joshua 9 through 12, you'll find that ancient Near Eastern accounts regularly used what you might call obliteration language. The terms like utterly annihilate or completely destroy, kill everyone. Just give you a couple of examples. Thutmose III, who reigned in the 15th century BC, he boasted that he completely annihilated a population group called the Mitannians, and he said that he annihilated them completely in 1 hour. And of course, we know historically and archaeologically they continued way down into the 14th century BC. So Thutmose III was exaggerating. He did not completely annihilate them. A very well-known inscription that probably many of your viewers are familiar with is the Moabite stone, sometimes referred to as the Mesha inscription. This is a 9th century inscription. He boasts that, from 2 Kings chapter 3, the account there that Moab had been under the thumb of northern Israel for some time. And so in the Moabite stone, King Mesha, the Moabite king, he claims to have rebelled against northern Israel and threw off their yoke of oppression. And he claimed that northern Israel had utterly perished for always. So you see 3 terms there: utterly perished, or totally, and then perished, and then always. So this threefold way of referring to their annihilation. Of course, that was totally not true. There are Jews living today. So they survived, for thousands of years. So there was something about the way they would word their battle reports that used this obliteration language, and it was standard. Sennacherib, just to give you one other example, Sennacherib reigned from 701 to 681 BC, and he boasted of having cut down, you think of like cutting down a tree, right? Chopping it down, destroying it. He said he cut down a population group called the Hieramites so that, quote, not one escaped, not one single person escaped. But, we know the Hieramites existed long past that time. So it was common to use this kind of obliteration language, even when the event didn't literally happen that way. This was a sort of a stereotypical hyperbolic language that emphasized the completeness of the victory. That's what it was designed to do, was emphasize the completeness of the victory. I think, this might sound really weird to modern listeners, and they might say, well, but isn't that lying? Were the authors of these books lying? Were the scribes who composed Tutmosis III's annals lying? Were Sennacherib scribes lying? Well, not really. This was just a convention that they used in talking. It reminds me a lot. I teach at Everett University in South Central Virginia. So when it comes time to have football games, we'll play against whatever. Say we have a game against Ferrum University, which is headed up Highway 220 on the way to Roanoke. And the two teams go out on the field, and Everett's football team and Ferrum's football team, and they're playing, hitting each other hard. And the guy in the stand sits there next to me. He says, "Man, we're killing them. We're just killing Ferrum. Look at how our team is mopping up the field with those Ferrum players. We've just totally killed them. We annihilated them." Well, then the game comes to an end, and what happens? The players line up and they shake hands before they go off the field, right? But we use obliteration language, annihilation language to talk about victory in sports. And what it means is not that we killed every single person and that no one got away, but it's that kind of obliteration language simply emphasizes the totality of the victory. I'll give you a quick example. I meant to have my Bible open to this page. This is so clear in Joshua chapter 10, verse 20, because you have this kind of image very clearly stated. So Joshua 10:20 says, when Joshua and the Israelites had finished inflicting a very great slaughter on them, their enemies, until they were wiped out. Okay, so Joshua's implemented a slaughter. They were wiped out, no one left breathing, that kind of thing. Well, then they led the survivors into the fortified towns. so they killed them, and then they led all the captives away. So is the author of Joshua lying? No, he's just using this typical, obliteration language. When you look at other ancient Near Eastern accounts, it's interesting. Again, they claim to annihilate the entire population, and then in the same texts, they'll talk about, how they led away the captives, or maybe they even levied a tribute against the city. So obviously, there are survivors in all those cases.
My closing question, what do we know about Joshua's death? And lastly, when was the book of Joshua composed?
Excuse me. What do we know about Joshua's death? Excuse me. That is a great question. And the book of Joshua does end with a death notice for Joshua. Let's see, it says Joshua died at the age of 110 years old. And Incidentally, in ancient Near Eastern texts, the ideal lifespan, for example, in Egyptian texts, the ideal lifespan was, if I recall, let me just double check that. Let's see, Moses. I'm looking at the death of Moses here. Moses died. He was 120 years old when he died. Yeah, Egyptian texts say that that was the ideal lifespan, was 120 years old. So Moses reached that, according to the author, Moses reached that ideal lifespan. I think that has to do with how the author of Exodus is trying to portray Moses as equal to or even superior to the Pharaoh. So he always is doing that kind of comparison. Interestingly, Joshua is said to die at 110 years old in Joshua chapter 24, verse 29. So the writer intentionally keeps him below Moses. He doesn't try to show that Joshua was as great as Moses. But it says they buried him in his own inheritance at Timnath Serah, which is in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. There is a team excavating right now at Timnath Serah. Oh gosh, and it seems like they're a team from Bart Elon University, but don't quote me on that. I cannot remember at the moment who is heading that team, but they it seems like they started that project about a year ago. So I don't know what they've found. I don't recall seeing any publications from them yet. And I just can't remember who that is conducting that excavation. Yeah, so the text doesn't say much at all, just that location, but it has been identified historically and geographically, and a team has launched an excavation there. So it'll be exciting to see what they might find. Oh, and you asked the second part of the question. What was it?
When does the book of Joshua date?
Oh, gosh, that's a really great question. And yeah, so I just, the date is highly contested. Part of the reason it's highly contested has to do with the portrayal of the violence. People don't like this violence, and so one of the strategies for coping with the violence is to, post date the book. It's very late, and the contents are a fictive retrojection, into the past. I think there's some evidence. Well, a common date would be to put it down in the 7th century BC, to date it like to the time of Josiah or later. I was reading one commentary this morning, and the author takes it all the way down to the Persian period. So a lot of argumentation about this. I do think there's some evidence within the book of Joshua that could suggest a context earlier than the 7th century BC, at least for much of the material in Joshua. One of the pieces that I think suggests that there's some earlier material in there. There's a phrase that's used repeatedly in the book of Joshua, ad hayom hazeh. So until this day is the author uses that phrase a number of times in the book and he's trying to show the credibility of his account. So he'll say that something happened and those conditions have persisted up until this day. And he refers back, for example, to the assimilation of Rahab and her mishpacha into the Israelite community. And he says, she has lived with us until this day. So that could suggest that that it was written at a time when Israelites may know some of the descendants of Rahab, or some more conservative scholars might even say that that suggests it was written at a time when some of them were still living. The writer's obviously using the phrase to try to establish the veracity of his claim. So, Joshua, Rahab and her people have lived among us ad hayom hazeh, until this day. So go check with them. But even if that's not the case, its usage certainly suggests the use of older sources. Let's see. Yeah, the ongoing service of the Gibeonites at Yahweh's altar suggests that the text has some antiquity. The reason I say that is because Saul, later on in his reign, he actually tried to wipe out the Gibeonites. And that account is given in 2 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 and 2. And so for the writer of Joshua to report the service of the Gibeonites, he says the Gibeonites have been here among us serving until this very day. That may suggest it was written at a time prior to the aggression of Israel's first king, Saul, maybe, right? Another thing in Joshua chapter 9, verse 27, the author uses the phrase "for the place he would choose," that is, for the sacred place Yahweh would choose. Well, that could indicate that passage was written at a time prior to the construction of the Jerusalem temple, because it seems to suggest at a place he would choose, or he will choose. So it hasn't been selected yet or identified yet. There's an emphasis in the book of Joshua on the Phoenician port city of Sidon, Sidon, and that's significant because from the classical period onward, Sidon was considered to be the most ancient and most prominent of the Canaanite coastal cities. But by the time of David, the city of Tyre had become dominant. So since Joshua 13:6 emphasizes Sidon over Tyre, it might be that passage was based on sources that predated David. So there are just lots of little clues like that. I could keep going, but I think little clues like that, there are many of them, and I think they suggest a context earlier than the 7th century BC. And they indicate usage of materials that go back, to quite ancient times. Those are just a few of the clues I would suggest. I'll discuss these more extensively in my forthcoming commentary on Joshua.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Professor Hawkins.
Thank you so much, Jacob. I've enjoyed it.
Yep, same here. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.